Well, I spent a lot of time in Aden in the past, before the current war, and during and since the current war. And I wanted to tell the story of the people of Aden. I also spent a lot of time with the UAE armed forces on the ground in Yemen. So I wanted to tell their story. So this was a place where I could tell the story of one of my favorite cities and the favorite populations in Aden, but also tell a war story about the UAE military, the way I saw them on the ground. The book was ready to write after about 2 years, but the Yemen war was very negatively viewed in Washington, D.C. in particular. So I wanted to wait a little while for the war to be seen in longer perspective and for people to be less angry about the war. And now that the war has had 1 year of ceasefire, uh, people are willing to hear about the Yemen war and be more fair in the way they listen to the war and talk about the war. So I spent time on the ground with the Saudi forces, the UAE forces, and the Yemeni forces in Yemen. And I watched the operations of the military forces, both at the headquarters level, but also down at the fighting level on the ground. And so I took my own knowledge from other wars, places like Iraq and Syria, and I went to Yemen, and then I learned about how the Yemen war was happening. And I spoke to many of the soldiers involved, Emirati soldiers, Yemeni soldiers, Saudi soldiers. And this gave me an understanding of the real details of the conflict. And the groups involved were happy to share the details because they knew that I would be fair when I told the story. I was not coming to Yemen to say the war is bad, the war is good. I was a historian trying to protect the story for the future so that future generations of young Yemenis or Emiratis can read about the war. Well, when you're a guest of Yemeni forces or Saudis or Emiratis, they want to protect you because you are their guest. And the responsibility is on them to keep you safe. So I always felt well protected. I knew that everyone with me would protect me with their lives. In a lot of cases, I'm wearing the same kind of body armor as a journalist working in a war zone. And, this is really the main kind of protection, the people you're with and some body armor and some training. And when you put those three things together, you have less risk than a soldier. So anyone who goes into a war zone is a little bit brave, but nobody is as brave as a soldier because the soldier has to go where the fighting is the worst and they cannot just leave. Whereas a writer or a journalist, if it gets too bad, you can leave. So I understand that the risk I took is a risk, but it's not the same risk as a soldier. Mohammed bin Zayed is a very good commander in chief. Most military officers do not have experience of senior leadership, political leadership. And most political leaders don't have military training. But Mohammed Zayed has got both. So he can bring his military training from Sandhurst and his training in the UAE, and then he brings that together with the political power that he holds. And when you put those two things together, it's a very powerful combination because the commander in chief is a trained soldier, but he can also command any resources in the country. So if he has an idea, he can make sure it happens. So, this was a good example of a military leader who is also at the top level of political power, and he uses his experience to make sure the war goes in a positive direction in the Battle of Aden. And, they're very lucky. The UAE was very lucky to have Mohammed bin Zayed as the commander-in-chief in this operation, because he is a good soldier and he has good military instincts. He trusts his commanders when they need to work things on their own, because they have the local understanding. But he also comes with good ideas that he gives to them. And if they agree, then that's a great combination. Yeah, so the UAE Armed Forces was very lucky to have had two strong leaders in a row, Sheikh Zayed and then Mohammed bin Zayed. This meant that they had over 10 years, really 20 years, of purchasing the right kind of military equipment. So by the time the Yemen war started, many key systems were in place and ready to go. From the C-17 transport aircraft that could fly tanks all the way from Abu Dhabi to the Red Sea, to Asab or to Aden. They had landing craft that could carry ships, carry tanks and armored equipment across the seas. The kind of F-16 strike aircraft that were in place for the start of the Yemen war. All of these things had been purchased with a lot of thought over the last 10 to 15 years before the war, and they were in place just in time so that the Emirates could use them to win the battles and also to save the lives of their soldiers and of local Yemeni fighters and civilians. So the UAE intervention in Aden helped to keep the port of Aden in the hands of the internationally recognized government. And this meant that southern Yemen stayed out of the hands of the Iran-backed Houthis. If Aden had fallen to the Houthis, then the Bab el-Mandeb would have stayed in the Houthi hands, and the whole Red Sea coast would have been controlled by the Houthis. The Houthis would also have had a place to launch missiles against shipping in the Indian Ocean as well. So the defense of Aden was what allowed the Gulf forces, the Arab coalition forces, to liberate Bab el-Mandeb and to liberate places like Mocha and Hoka on the Red Sea coast, and to keep the Houthis out of the Indian Ocean. And that was critical for global shipping safety. Yes, the United States decided that it did not want to be part of the Yemen war. And what was so impressive about the Arab coalition is that there were, for the first time, without US help, the Arab states got together and deployed forces to a conflict. In large numbers, the air campaign was pulled together very quickly and was initially quite effective at disarming the major forces that the Houthis had captured in Sana'a and northern Yemen. And the Emirati part of the coalition was very effective in helping southern Yemen, which was the furthest away from Saudi territory. And so it was the most difficult military challenge that the coalition faced, having to operate at long range. Normally, the US would do that kind of thing. But in this case, the Emirates did it on their own, and they did it very effectively. US military history over the last 20 years has shown that even if you have a very strong air force, an air force alone cannot win a war. You need ground forces, you need naval forces to be able to control land or to control sea and ports. And this is what Mohammed bin Zayed brought to bear very quickly. He realized from reading military history, from being a military historian and a trained military officer, that air power on its own would not stop the Houthis from taking control of Aden, Marib, and all the other parts of Yemen. So he said we need to insert ground forces into Yemen to help guide the airstrikes and to help support the Yemeni resistance forces. And that's what they did. Well, Mohammed bin Zayed and the UAE High Command are very good at accepting risk. In the West, in the US particularly, we can sometimes be scared of taking risks. But the UAE is quite good at assessing the risk. Is this going to work? Is it not going to work? And then committing to the course of action and following it through to the very end. So, you know, it was a risky step to put forces into Yemen. But whenever the UAE was asked, do you want to leave or do you want to increase the amount of forces you have on the ground? They said, we're going to increase the amount of forces on the ground and finish the job. I think the Emirates learned that they could do a military operation like this on their own. And if they need to, they can do it without the Americans. And they can do it very successfully. I think the Emirates also learned, though, that if the international community does not approve of a war, then it's very difficult to stay in that war open-ended. At some point, you have to say, either we can finish this war with a victory or we have to leave now. And so in 2018, 2019, the Emirates said, okay, there's no more offensive operations. We cannot take Hodeidah because of international pressure. We cannot take Sana'a. So it's time to change the way we're operating. And that led into the Stockholm process, and that led into the year-long ceasefire that we have now. So, yeah, the Emirates learned that at a certain point, if the international community is not willing to support a military solution, then you go with the diplomatic solution instead. The people involved in the war, whether they're Yemenis or whether they are Emiratis, they don't talk about the war very much. So for me, as a military historian, talking to them about their experience of the war was very good for them. It's a good thing to talk about a war that you've been in. It helps you to understand your thoughts, your feelings about the war, and it's good for your mental health. So I think it's a good thing that people are starting to talk about the war and their experiences in it. They will all take away different lessons from the conflict, but one of the most important ones for Emiratis is that they've been to Yemen and they've seen what it's like when you are in a country that's lost its security. And the main feeling of the Emirati soldiers when they come back is that we must never lose our security inside the United Arab Emirates. We have to keep security and we have to keep the country together in one piece. And that, I think, was a strong lesson for most of the young men and women who went to Yemen. You know, If your country is not together, then it is weak. So they focused on unity. Well, the UAE learned that it could do air, land, and sea operations individually on its own. I think it gave the UAE military a lot of confidence. But it also taught the UAE military that you don't stay forever. You go, you do the job, and then you mostly leave. You know, the UAE military is still quite a small military. And the same officers were used for 5, 6 years in a row in Yemen. And eventually that makes them very, very tired. So, you know, the UAE learned it could do amazing things, but it also learned that after a couple of years, you have to power down and give people a rest and fix the equipment, buy new equipment, because war is expensive and war makes your armed forces very tired, especially the parts of it that you use the most, like the air crews and the special forces. You know, these people need their rest, they need their training, and they need to go back to military education and back to their families. Well, the soldiers of and sailors and airmen of the UAE are quite brave. They Many of them had been in other conflicts like Kosovo, Somalia, Afghanistan, but they had never been in a really big war like this, which involved all the modern weapons of warfare: drones, landmines, guided missiles. So this was almost like the same kind of experience that we see in Ukraine at the moment. They were in a very high intensity war in which becoming a casualty was real possibility. And considering that, the UAE armed forces did very well. They, generally speaking, were not afraid all the time, and they effectively completed their missions. Uh, they often lived in Yemen for long periods of time. You know, when a Western soldier goes to Iraq, he goes there for 9 months, let's say. But a lot of UAE soldiers were in Yemen for a lot longer than that. So, you know, I think they had a lot of bravery, and also they stuck with the mission until the mission was complete. The future of Yemen is probably a divided country solution, meaning that maybe Yemen will go back to being a federation, or even two countries, or even three countries. And we have to think very hard about whether that is good for Yemen or bad for Yemen. I think in many ways the people of Yemen are comfortable being a federation, being loosely connected together, not run by just one place like Sana'a or Aden or Marib. So we'll leave it up to the Yemeni people, but I think maybe Yemen will be less centralized than it was under Ali Abdullah Saleh, and that could be a good thing. Well, it has to be achieved through a United Nations backed negotiation process, one where the rights of the different parts of the country are respected by the other parts of the country. Yemen is a place where the different parts of the country have to work together. So some parts of the country have oil and gas, like Marib. Other parts of the country have ports, like Hadramaut and Shabwa and the Red Sea coast. Other parts of the country have the national government center and airports. So the country has to work together to make all these things, land borders, ports, energy, airports, central bank, all these things are spread across the country. And the Federation will have to work together in the future to be in a functional economy.